The pilot did not check his watch when he crossed into Iranian airspace. He already knew the time. 0217. The Bavar 373 battery 40 kilometers to his south was sweeping on its standard rotation cycle. He had 11 seconds before the next pulse. He used 9 of them. The F-22 slipped through the gap like a knife through silk, and the radar swept clean air where an aircraft had been half a second before. No return, no ghost, nothing. Somewhere below, a technician watched a clean screen and saw exactly what he was supposed to see. Everything was fine. Everything was normal. The Raptor was already gone. That mission happened 3 nights ago. The recordings it brought back are still being analyzed. What they found inside Iran's electromagnetic interior, inside the pulse intervals and data link frequencies of the Bavar network, changed the timeline. Not by weeks, by days. 4,000 kilometers to the west, on a runway in southern Israel, 11 F-22 Raptors sat in hardened shelters at Nevatim Air Base. Their engines were cold. Their pilots were not. The official Pentagon language surrounding their arrival was the same language it always is. Rotational presence, regional interoperability, words designed to communicate as little as possible about something that communicates everything. You do not forward deploy America's most capable stealth fighter, an aircraft never exported to a single ally in its entire operational history, to a runway 12 minutes of flight time from Iranian airspace for routine anything. Every air defense commander from Ankara to Riyadh read the message the moment the first Raptor touched down. The aircraft did not need to fire a single weapon to change the strategic equation across the entire region. Its presence on that runway was the message. 17 nautical miles off the Israeli coastline, the USS Gerald R sat at the center of a 7-warship strike group. Beneath its flight deck, over 70 aircraft were staged and ready. F-18 Super Hornets, EA-18 Growlers built to blind and burn every radar frequency Iran's air defense network depends on. E-2D Hawkeyes, capable of managing the entire aerial battle space from 60,000 feet. Somewhere beneath the surface, running silent and unannounced, a Virginia-class attack submarine tracked the Ford's position and waited. The Abraham Lincoln strike group was already positioned further east, its own air wing ready, its own submarines quiet. Together, the two carrier groups represented the largest concentration of American naval firepower in the Middle East in over 2 decades. 15 warships, more than 10,000 personnel, enough sustained strike capacity to operate continuously for weeks without resupply. Washington had not announced a deadline publicly. It did not need to. 3 weeks earlier, the American negotiating team in Geneva had handed Iranian diplomats a document. The language was precise, and the demands were not symbolic. Fordow, Natanz, Isfahan, all 3 nuclear sites to be verifiably dismantled. All enriched uranium above 5% to be physically transferred to American custody. The Iranian delegation read the document, asked 2 clarifying questions, and said they would need to consult Tehran. They consulted Tehran. Tehran's answer came back in 48 hours. The answer was no. Trump's response was not delivered in a press conference. It was delivered in physics. Within 72 hours of Tehran's rejection, the F-22s landed at Nevatim. Within 96 hours, the Ford strike group received its movement orders and accelerated east. The message required no translation for any government in the region. The clock had started. Nobody publicly said how much time was on it. In Tehran, the people did not need a public announcement. They had been watching the news. They had been watching the satellite images circulating on encrypted messaging apps showing American carriers repositioning. They had been watching the price of the dollar against the rial collapse in real time on their phones. A 28-year-old engineer in the Elahiyeh district spent Thursday evening methodically assembling what he called a sensible kit. A portable power bank, a shortwave radio, 3 weeks of dried food, $200 in cash hidden in the lining of a jacket. He had done this once before, in 2019, when the tensions spiked and the electricity went out for 16 hours and nobody explained why. He was not panicking, he was calculating. There is a difference, and Iranians have learned it over decades of living inside that difference. The woman at the corner market in northeastern Tehran did not explain why she was buying 6 months of canned goods on a Tuesday morning. She did not need to. The man behind her in line was doing the same thing. So was the one behind him. By midday, the shelves were half empty. By evening, the bottled water was gone. By the following morning, the store owner had tripled his order from the wholesale distributor and was told delivery would be delayed because every other store in the district had done the same thing simultaneously. No government announcement had been made. No official warning had been issued. The people of Tehran did not need one. They had been reading the sky long enough to know what certain kinds of clouds mean. Iran's government said nothing useful publicly. State television ran its standard programming. Officials made their standard statements. Sovereignty would be defended. Any aggression would be met with a response that would set the region on fire. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply moves every single day, would become a weapon if American forces moved against Iranian territory. These were not new statements. Iran had been issuing variations of them for 20 years. The difference now was that the people issuing them were doing so from the same country where ordinary citizens were quietly buying shortwave radios and hiding cash in jacket linings, and where the currency had lost 30% of its value in 11 days. The F-22 pilots at Nevatim flew their daily sorties on the published training schedule. Ranges over the Negev, standard profiles, nothing that would appear unusual on any radar screen watching Israeli airspace from the outside. What the published schedule did not include were the quiet hours between 0100 and 0400 local time, when the hardened shelters stayed lit and the crew chiefs ran checks that were not logged in the routine maintenance records. Preparation has its own sound, if you know how to listen for it. The ground crews at Nevatim had been listening to that sound for 10 days. The Abraham Lincoln's flight deck never fully went quiet. Day and night, in rotating cycles, aircraft launched and recovered, keeping pilots current, keeping systems warm, keeping the machinery of a carrier strike group in the state of readiness that takes weeks to build and hours to lose. The Ford's flight deck matched it. From above, from any commercial satellite with a clear line of sight, the two carriers looked like floating cities that had forgotten how to sleep. Intelligence analysts in a dozen capitals were pulling those satellite images every 6 hours and briefing their governments on what they saw. What they saw had not changed in 10 days. Everything was still pointed east. Somewhere inside Iran's air defense network, the officers responsible for tracking American movements were doing the same calculations the American planners were doing, but from the opposite direction. They knew the F-22s were at Nevatim. They knew the carriers were positioned. They had watched the Geneva talks collapse in real time. They had their own timeline running, their own assessment of when the window would open, their own understanding of what the next 72 hours might bring. The Bavar 373 batteries were at heightened readiness. The F-14 interceptors were sitting alert at hardened shelters across the northwest. The Fakkur 90 rails were loaded. Both sides were watching the same clock. Neither side had publicly admitted the clock existed, and in the markets of Tehran, on streets that had survived revolution and war and sanctions and earthquake and every other weight history chooses to drop on a city, people were buying water and batteries and dried food and saying nothing to each other about why. Because some things do not need to be said out loud to be completely understood by everyone in the room. The F-22s at Nevatim were fueled. The carriers were turning into the wind. The clock was not counting up.